I don't even know how to start this without my hands shaking, but maybe that's the point. Maybe I've been silent so long that the only way to finally breathe is to write it down. I grew up in a house where image mattered more than reality. My mom was the type who smiled like a politician when neighbors were watching, then turned cold the second the door shut. My dad, he was the kind of guy who thought yelling was the same as teaching, that tough love meant breaking you down until you had nothing left to stand on. And my uncle, let's just say he was treated like some kind of golden son, even though he wasn't their kid. When I was 12, it started. I won't give the graphic details, but it was him. My uncle, the same guy they bragged about, the one who always knew best, the one they'd shove me toward with lines like, "Go ask your uncle, he'll show you how to be a man." He was supposed to be family, but he turned me into his secret. When I finally got the courage, God, it took everything in me to tell my mom. I thought she'd hold me, or at least look shocked. Instead, she leaned in close like she was scared the walls would hear and whispered, "Don't ruin the family by spreading stories." Like I had just admitted to some embarrassing lie instead of dropping the heaviest truth of my life. Dad, he didn't even blink. He just stared and then said, "Take it like a man. Your cousins didn't complain." I swear, those words carved something into me I don't think I'll ever fully scrape out. I wanted to scream, to ask him how he could compare pain to manhood, but all that came out was silence. And that silence stuck. For years, I carried it. And worse, I had to sit across from that man every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, watching him laugh at the head of the table like he was some kind of king. They toasted him, toasted his wisdom. To Uncle, while I was sitting there shrinking smaller and smaller, biting my tongue so hard I'd taste blood just to keep from blurting the truth. And the worst part? I started to believe them. I started to think maybe I was weak. Maybe I really was the problem. Because that's the game they played. If I acted cold, I was ungrateful. If I cried, I was dramatic. If I avoided him, I was disrespectful. Every move I made, they twisted, and I'd end up in my room staring at the ceiling, hating myself more than I hated him. I remember one Christmas. I must have been 16. He reached over and clapped me on the back in front of everyone. My dad laughed and said, "That's a real man's handshake." My mom smiled like she was proud. I wanted to vomit right there at the table, but instead I forced a smile so no one would ask questions. That's how far gone I was. I was trained to make myself disappear. By the time I hit 18, I had this fantasy in my head that I'd leave, and then none of it would matter anymore. I thought distance would erase the damage. But trauma doesn't care about zip codes. You can be on the other side of the country and still hear his laugh, still hear your mom whispering in your ear to stop spreading stories. And then one day, I don't even know what broke in me exactly. I just couldn't carry it anymore. I was 23. I was working a crappy retail job, living in a rundown apartment, trying to pretend I was normal. But every night I'd sit in the shower, knees pulled up to my chest, replaying everything. And one night, I just said out loud, "He doesn't get to win anymore." The next morning, I went to the police. I told them everything. I gave the statements. I shook through the interviews. They didn't laugh. They didn't dismiss me. They wrote it down, and they believed me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't treated like the liar in the room. But when the cops showed up at my parents' house to question him, the fallout was immediate. My phone blew up. My mom screaming, "How could you betray us like this?" My dad cursing me out, saying I destroyed the family's name. Not once, did they ask if I was okay. Not once did they even pretend to care. Their loyalty was never to me. It was to him. And sitting in that interrogation room, as they went over my statement again, all I could think was how surreal it felt. Like I'd been waiting my whole life for someone else to finally acknowledge the truth. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I wasn't making it up. The day of the hearing, when they walked him into court in handcuffs, I swear I almost couldn't breathe. My parents were there, sitting on his side, glaring at me like I'd murdered someone. Their eyes burned holes into me. But then I looked at him, my uncle, and for the first time, he didn't look powerful. He looked small. And something in me shifted. I realized I was never their son. I was their scapegoat, their punching bag, their wall to hide the cracks in their perfect little family picture. But now, without me to silence, they had no one left to blame. And honestly, that thought carried me through that courtroom like armor. After that first court date, everything in my life felt like it had been set on fire. Except it wasn't the kind of fire that warms you or lights a path. It was the kind that eats through everything you thought you could stand on. The trial didn't happen right away. It stretched out for months, and those months were some of the darkest I've ever lived through. You'd think reporting your abuser would come with some sense of relief, but honestly, it just cracked open more chaos. My parents went nuclear. Every single call from them was some version of, "Do you understand what you've done?" Or "Your uncle's life is ruined because of you." Not one sentence about my life already being ruined because of him. My mom would cry on the phone, like I'd stabbed her in the back. My dad kept throwing that line at me. "You should have taken it like a man." Like being silent about trauma was some badge of honor. I started blocking their numbers, but then they'd show up in other ways. Relatives messaging me on Facebook. "Why are you doing this to the family?" Old neighbors DMing me after my mom went around telling people I'd lost my mind and was making up stories for attention. She spun it into this whole narrative where I was jealous of my cousins, that I'd always been troubled. It's wild how fast people will believe a convenient lie if it saves them from having to face something ugly. And the family gatherings, they didn't stop having them. They just stopped inviting me. I'd see photos on social media, Thanksgiving spreads, everyone smiling, my uncle's empty seat like it was some tragic loss. My cousin even posted, "We miss you, Uncle, praying for justice." And I just sat there staring at my phone like, WDYM justice? Justice for who? For the man who stole years of my life? The isolation hit hard. At first, I kept questioning myself, like maybe I'd opened a door I wasn't strong enough to walk through. But then I'd remember his hand on my shoulder, his laugh in my ear, my dad's voice telling me to take it like a man. And I'd snap back to reality. No, this isn't on me. The court process itself was brutal. Giving testimony was like being ripped open in public. You sit there with lawyers asking you to recount things you've spent half your life trying not to remember. My voice would shake, my hands would sweat, and I'd catch my parents' eyes in the gallery, cold and cutting. They weren't there to support me. They were there to support him. Their presence said everything. "You don't matter. He does." But here's the part one didn't expect. People started to believe me. The detective who took my case, the prosecutor who sat me down and said, "We've got enough to move forward." Even strangers in the courtroom when I testified. You could feel it in the air, the shift, the way silence carried weight. It was like the universe whispering, "You're not crazy. You're not alone." Still, the fallout at home kept coming. One night, my brother called me, drunk as hell, saying, "Why do you have to drag this all into the light? You couldn't just leave it alone." Like I'd inconvenienced him by refusing to keep being abused in silence. That call ended with him slurring, "You're dead to us." And for a second, I actually felt it. The sting of being cut off, the grief of losing the family I kept hoping would wake up and finally see me. But then another voice in my head said, "Maybe they were dead to you first. Maybe they'd been gone the whole time, and I was just the last one holding on to the illusion that blood means love." The first time I saw my uncle in court after he'd been out on bail, he looked at me with this expression that I'll never forget. Not fear, not shame, pure contempt. Like he still thought I was beneath him, even in handcuffs. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't scared because he'd lived his whole life convinced people like my parents would always protect him. And they had, until me. I won't lie, though, I almost broke more than once. Nights where I'd be sitting alone in my apartment, feeling like the whole world hated me, wondering if it'd be easier to just disappear. PTSD is real. The flashbacks, the panic attacks, the way my body would flinch if someone moved too quickly near me. It all came flooding back worse than ever. Therapy became less of an option and more of a survival tool. And my therapist said something I still hold on to. You're grieving two losses at once, the loss of your innocence and the loss of parents who were never really there for you. That line shattered me, but it also gave me clarity. Because that's the truth I'd been running from. I was never their son, not in the way kids are supposed to be sons. I was their scapegoat, their problem to silence, the body they shoved pain into so they wouldn't have to face their own rot. By the time the trial date finally arrived, I'd built this quiet resolve. I didn't feel strong. I felt wrecked. But I also felt clear. Like, if the whole world hated me for speaking the truth, fine. At least I wasn't hating myself for staying quiet anymore. When the verdict came down and they cuffed him again, I swear the room spun. My parents glared at me, eyes full of venom. Relatives shook their heads. But none of it touched me the way it used to. Because in that moment, For the first time in my life, I knew something they'd never understand. I wasn't the weak one. I was the one who broke the cycle. And deep down, that scared the hell out of them more than losing him ever could. After the verdict, you'd think the storm would pass. If anything, it sharpened. My parents didn't fold quietly and accept what had happened. They weaponized the shame like it was theirs to throw. The narrative flipped in their mouths so fast it made my head spin. Suddenly, I was the one with the problem. I was the person who'd broken up the family. I had made up accusations for attention. The audacity of them blaming me for the consequences of his actions wasn't just maddening. It was almost cartoonish. It started with my mom. She called relatives in a frenzy, crying into phones and painting this picture of me as unstable, reckless, dramatic. She knew what would work. People always want a simple villain they can hate instead of looking deeper. She told them I'd been disturbed as a kid, that I'd been acting out for years, that I'd always needed help. Some listened and shook their heads like she'd told them the weather report. Others kept asking questions. A few reached out to me privately and said they were surprised, that they'd never seen the signs. Those few were like life rafts. Then my dad went public in a way that stunned me. He wrote a long, performative Facebook post, not naming names, but you could smell the guilt on it like burnt toast. Lines about family unity, how tragedy tears at the seams, how we all make mistakes. It was a masterclass in emotional sleight of hand. People liked and shared it, left comments about tough times and forgiveness. My notifications filled with cousins saying, "We'll always be family," which felt to me like the slow closing of a door. By week 2, the smear campaign took on a life of its own. My uncle's supporters, a small circle, but loud, started spreading stuff I knew wasn't true, that I sought attention, that I'd had issues with authority my whole life, that I'd once tried to extort money. One relative, who I thought I could trust, messaged me to say, gently, that maybe I should consider therapy instead of court, because public trials will follow you forever. Another cousin confronted me in a grocery store aisle as if this were a punchline. "You really did this, huh?" With a half smile that wanted to be sympathy but landed as judgment. It split the extended family into camps. There were the ones who called and said, "I'm sorry, I believe you." Those voices were small, quiet, and steady. They mattered more than I could explain. The other camp wrote me off, politely at first, then cold. Some invited my brother to weddings, baby showers, barbecues, and sent him photos afterwards with captions like, "Wish you were here." He soaked it up. He wanted their approval because it validated the cowardice he'd always been taught to lean on. The most painful part wasn't the people who turned away. It was watching my parents double down and watch people follow. My mom started going to church more, pushing a smile so wide it looked like rehearsal. My dad returned to his old posture of prideful stoicism, and the world rewarded them with pity and platitudes. They'd created a version of themselves that audiences could love, sore, wronged elders, bewildered by the collapse of their world. That image was easier for people to grasp than the idea their golden boy could be capable of something monstrous. Meanwhile, the practical stuff didn't stop. The court date closed a chapter but opened another kind of daily warfare. Insurance claims, counseling appointments, restraining orders, things that had to be handled by me because no one else would help. I felt like I was running uphill while being punched in the face by numbness and adrenaline. Some days I was furious enough to move mountains. Other days I could barely get out of bed. Guilt rode shotgun the whole time. Guilt for the family that had been, or appeared to be, taken from me. Guilt because even though he got what he deserved legally, the price I paid was the family I'd once hoped for. Therapy helped more than I expected. Not in a miraculous overnight way, but in the slow steadying of a hand you take when your world's been shaken. My therapist didn't fix my parents. She taught me to name the feelings: anger, grief, shame, relief, black and white panic. She let me say, aloud, that I felt liberated and guilty at the same time. That I missed the concept of family, even while knowing certain people had never been family at all. That paradox lived in my chest like a stone. And then there was the weird freedom. It arrived not as fireworks, but as little breaths. A morning when I didn't flinch at a knock on the door. A commute where I didn't replay words in my head. A half hour where I read a book and didn't feel compelled to scan for danger. Freedom felt like permission to be angry, to rebuild, to grieve without explanation. I started saying no to invitations that felt performative. I stopped calling out to fill a role I never asked for. That's when people started whispering that I was cold. But being cold was better than being complicit. A handful of relatives reached out over time with apologies that felt sincere. One uncle drove 3 hours just to hand me a folded letter and say he'd been wrong to doubt me. Those were the moments that mattered, not the thousands of likes and the curated sympathy, but single acts of accountability. They validated that truth has a way of seeping through, awkward and slow. There were consequences I didn't anticipate. Jobs I'd hoped for quietly dried up because of gossip. People I dated asked too many questions, and I realized quickly that coping with trauma in a relationship is work you don't owe anyone until you're ready. The court victory didn't mean everything healed. It meant the abuser was behind bars. It didn't magically reattach the parts of me they'd made me distrust. But there was also an unexpected reclamation. I started volunteering with a local support group for survivors. I began writing again, small things at first, because telling the story in a safe space felt like carving out territory for myself. I rebuilt friendships that were real and saw how chosen family could be stronger than the biological kind. Those people sat with me, brought over casseroles, drove me to court dates, and didn't expect me to perform pain for their comfort. If I'm honest, I still miss what could have been: a mother who would hold me, a father who'd protect me, a family that would put my safety above appearances. That fantasy does not vanish overnight, but I'm learning to mourn it without living there. I learned there are losses you survive and losses that reshape you into someone who can protect themselves. When the dust settled somewhat, I realized I wasn't just the kid who'd been broken. I was the one who'd reported the truth. That changed how I looked at myself. The world had been ugly for me, yes, but I chose not to hand that ugliness forward. I refused to keep quiet so others could keep smiling. And in the quiet, painful, expensive aftermath, I found threads of myself I hadn't known were still there: tenacity, a voice, a refusal to be the scapegoat anymore. Rebuilding doesn't look like what movies tell you. There's no big aha moment where the trauma is suddenly behind you and you're smiling in a new apartment with sunlight streaming in. For me, it was more like dragging myself out of mud 1 inch at a time, realizing halfway up that the mud wasn't just behind me. It had soaked into my skin. At first, boundaries felt impossible. My parents kept trying to force contact, even after everything. My mom would send long messages about forgiveness, but when you stripped them down, what she meant was, forgive him and come back into the fold. Not once did she say she was sorry. Not once did she acknowledge what had been done to me. My dad, on the other hand, would go radio silent for weeks, then suddenly blow up my phone with caps lock texts about how I'd ruined the family legacy. It was like he thought loyalty was some bank account I'd overdraft on purpose. I had to draw the line. Blocking them felt like betraying some primal instinct. I mean, they were still my parents, even if they never acted like it. But every time I saw their names on my screen, my body went into fight or flight. Eventually, I realized contact wasn't keeping me tethered, it was choking me. So I hit block. Not just on calls, but on email, socials, everything. I thought I'd feel relief, but what I really felt at first was grief. Like I'd just buried people who were technically still alive. The legal fallout dragged on. Appeals, paperwork, hearings, it was exhausting. My uncle's lawyer tried every trick in the book, including framing me as some bitter kid out for revenge. Sitting in a courtroom while a stranger basically calls you a liar, while your parents nod along in the gallery, is a special kind of hell. But every time doubt crept in, the prosecutor would slide me a reassuring glance, and it grounded me. I wasn't the one on trial, even if it felt that way. Meanwhile, I was working whatever jobs I could string together. Retail, delivery, late-night stocking. Trauma doesn't pay bills, and neither does being disowned. I'd come home to my one bedroom, sit on the floor with takeout, and try to convince myself I was building something. Some nights, the silence felt crushing, but other nights, it felt like peace. No one barging in. No footsteps outside my door that made my heart spike. Just me, alone, but safe. That's when I started finding people who actually saw me. A coworker at one job noticed I'd freeze when certain customers raised their voices. Instead of mocking me, she quietly asked if I was okay. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. She invited me to her friend group, and for the first time, I sat in a living room full of people laughing without having to pretend I was fine. I wasn't just the scapegoat there. I was just me. I won't lie, I still caught myself flinching. When someone offered me a drink, my brain replayed all those holidays where I poured glasses for relatives while they toasted the man who hurt me. At first, I refused, but eventually, one night, I took a sip of cheap beer and realized it didn't taste like shame anymore. It just tasted like beer. Small victories, but they stacked up. Therapy stayed central. My therapist challenged me hard, asked me why I still said my family when all I described was a machine built to silence me. She pushed me to reframe. Not my family disowned me, but I stepped away from people who chose to harm me. That shift in language felt like reclaiming something. Like maybe I wasn't abandoned, maybe I walked. It wasn't all progress. There were setbacks. Nights I woke up drenched in sweat from nightmares. Mornings I almost called my mom just to hear her voice. Afternoons when loneliness cut deep. But each time, I made myself sit with the discomfort instead of running back to the people who created it. Healing wasn't linear, but it was movement. One turning point came during a survivor support group I'd started attending. We sat in a circle, swapping stories, and one guy said, "Sometimes I feel guilty that I got out, because I know someone else is still stuck." Those words hit me like a freight train. I realized I'd been carrying that same guilt, like by speaking out, I'd abandoned the kid version of me who couldn't escape, or the cousins who maybe went through the same thing but stayed silent. But hearing someone else voice it made me realize guilt wasn't proof I'd done wrong. It was proof I cared. That same group introduced me to the idea of chosen family. It sounded cheesy at first, like a bumper sticker slogan. But slowly, I began to see it in action. Friends who texted me to check in without expecting anything back. People who celebrated my small wins, like finishing a semester of night classes I'd signed up for. The ones who didn't need me to explain why holidays were hard. They just made space. That felt more like family than anything my parents ever gave me. I started writing again, not for anyone else, but for me. Journals filled with messy handwriting, fragments of memories, flashes of anger. Sometimes I'd write letters to my parents, not to send, but to get the venom out of my system. I deserve protection. I was your son. You chose him over me. Seeing those words in ink made them real, made me stop gaslighting myself. By the end of that year, I wasn't healed, but I was sturdier. I could look in the mirror and not just see the broken kid at the table, shrinking under his uncle's shadow. I saw a man who made the impossible choice, to step into the fire and come out scarred, but standing. And maybe that's what survival really is, not erasing the scars, but refusing to let them define you as only scars. It's been years now, and sometimes I catch myself wondering what my parents tell people about me these days. I'm sure the story's evolved. Maybe I'm still the disturbed son who lost his way. Maybe I've become a ghost they pretend doesn't exist. Either way, I've learned that what they say doesn't have to define me anymore. That's a freedom I never thought I'd earn. Breaking free from being the scapegoat didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like walking out of a fog you didn't realize you'd been in your whole life. The thing about being raised to carry blame is that you start to mistake it for identity. Every mistake, every failure, every sideways glance, my first thought used to be, that's on me. It took years of therapy, support groups, and raw conversations to peel that off my skin. What really did it for me wasn't some lightning bolt of healing. It was ordinary moments. Like when a friend called me reliable because I showed up to help him move, and I realized no one in my family had ever used that word about me unless it was sarcastic. Or when I was at a barbecue with my support group, sitting on a picnic blanket, and someone's kid ran up and asked if I'd play catch. I froze at first. Kids made me nervous because of all the baggage I carried. But then I threw the ball, and he laughed, and it was just simple. For the first time, I felt like maybe I could exist in this world without the weight of what had been done to me. The chosen family thing? It stopped sounding corny. It became real. My coworker turned friend became my roommate for a while. We built a little household where no one yelled, where the worst fight we ever had was over dishes. Later, I started dating someone patient enough to sit with my silences and gentle enough to remind me I didn't have to earn love by suffering first. They didn't look at me like a project or a broken thing. They looked at me like a person. And being treated like a person after years of being treated like a problem? That's a kind of healing I never expected. Holidays are still tough. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. The first Christmas I spent away from my blood family. I sat in my apartment staring at a tiny tree I bought at Walmart, wondering if I'd made a mistake. But then my phone buzzed with text from my new circle. Come over, we've got food. You're family to us. I went, and it didn't erase the ache, but it dulled it. Now, every year, I choose where I want to be, and that choice itself feels like rebellion. As for my parents, I haven't seen them in years. Sometimes I'll hear through the grapevine that they're still bitter, still holding onto their version of events. I used to fantasize about confronting them one last time, demanding an apology, forcing them to acknowledge the truth. But I've learned that chasing closure from people who benefit from denying you will only keep you tethered to them. The closure I got wasn't from their mouths. It was from mine when I finally said, they don't get to define me anymore. The guilt still tries to creep in. Survivor's guilt, family guilt, the whole mix. Some nights, I wonder if my cousins went through what I did and just stayed silent. I wonder if cutting ties means I left them behind. But then I remind myself, the only reason I survived was because I stopped playing by their rules. Maybe my story can be a lantern for someone else who's still in the dark. I won't pretend I'm fixed. There are scars I'll carry forever. I still have days where a loud laugh in a crowded room makes my stomach turn because it reminds me of him. I still wake up sometimes with my chest tight, memories pressing down like they're happening in real time. Healing isn't linear, and it isn't clean, but it's real, and it's mine. Looking back, the kid I was, the one sitting at the kids' table while the adults toasted the man who hurt me. He never thought he'd get here. He thought silence was survival. He thought disappearing was the only option. If I could sit across from him now, I'd tell him, you're not weak. You're not crazy. And one day, you'll take your story back. The truth is, my parents lost more than I did. They lost a son, but I lost illusions. They lost their scapegoat, but I lost my chains. And without me there to soak up their blame, they're left facing themselves. Maybe that's why they'll never forgive me, not because of what I said, but because I showed them who they really are. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll start a family of my own someday. Maybe I won't. What I do know is that if I do, that family will be built on truth, not appearances. On protection, not silence. On love, not loyalty tests. Because at the end of the day, surviving isn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about refusing to let it decide your future. And for the first time in my life, that future feels like mine to write.